The sound of gunfire echoed through the town of Hillsborough, Texas, as Penelope Turner ran for her life, her heart pounding in rhythm with her footsteps on the dusty road. It was 1875, and the frontier town had erupted into chaos after a bank robbery gone wrong left 3 men dead and the sheriff wounded. For Penelope, the violence was just another nightmare in a life that had spiraled out of control since her father's death 3 months earlier. Penelope's skirts whipped around her ankles as she fled past the saloon, ignoring the curious stares of men lounging on the porch. The stable at the edge of town was her only thought a place to hide, to catch her breath, to figure out what to do next. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, streaming behind her like a banner as she ran. She burst through the stable doors, the familiar scent of hay and horses enveloping her as she searched frantically for a hiding place. The stable was mercifully empty of people, though several horses shifted nervously in their stalls, disturbed by her dramatic entrance. Penelope pressed herself into the farthest corner, sliding down against the rough wooden wall until she sat on the straw-covered floor, drawing her knees up to her chest. Only then did she allow herself to break down. The tears came in violent, racking sobs that shook her slender frame. Everything she'd worked for was lost. The deed to her father's ranch had been in her reticule, the very reticule that had been snatched from her hands by one of the bank robbers as they escaped. Without that deed, she had no proof the land was hers, and her father's business partner, Vernon Walsh, would claim it all for himself, just as he'd been threatening to do. Penelope was so consumed by her grief that she didn't hear the stable doors open, nor the soft footsteps approaching. It wasn't until a shadow fell across her that she looked up, startled and afraid. Caleb Everett stood there, his tall frame silhouetted against the light from the stable doorway. His face was partly hidden by the brim of his worn leather hat, but she could see his eyes a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, watching her with a mixture of concern and wariness. Without a word, the cowboy sat down beside her in the corner, his back against the wall, boots stretched out in front of him. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, just sat there in silence as she cried. Penelope tried to stop her tears, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state by a stranger, but the grief and fear were too overwhelming. She buried her face in her hands and continued to weep. "Take your time," Caleb said after several minutes, his voice low and gentle. Sometimes a good cry is the only sensible thing to do. His unexpected kindness only made her cry harder. It had been so long since anyone had shown her a moment of compassion. Caleb remained silent again, seemingly content to sit with her while she gathered herself. Finally, Penelope's sobs subsided to hiccuping breaths. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, not caring about the propriety her mother had once tried so hard to instill in her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Nothing to be sorry for," he replied. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, offering it to her without looking in her direction. Penelope accepted it gratefully, dabbing at her eyes and face. "You must think me a foolish woman." "I don't make a habit of judging folks I don't know," Caleb said. "Especially not on their worst days." She studied him then, taking in the lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting in the Texas sun, the neatly trimmed beard that covered his jaw, the capable hands that rested on his knees. He wasn't a young man, but he wasn't old either, perhaps 30 or so, with streaks of silver just beginning to show in his dark hair at the temples. "You're not from Hillsborough," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Just passing through," he confirmed. "Was having a drink at the saloon when those men hit the bank. Heard the shots, saw you running." Penelope tensed. "You followed me, wanted to make sure you weren't hurt," he said simply. "Those men seemed to take a particular interest in you." The reminder of her lost reticule and the deed it contained brought fresh tears to Penelope's eyes. "They took everything," she whispered. "Everything that mattered." Caleb remained quiet, waiting for her to continue if she chose to. "My father died 3 months ago," she found herself telling him. Left me the ranch, but his business partner disputes the will, claims they had a verbal agreement that supersedes it. She twisted the handkerchief between her fingers. The deed was the only proof I had. It was in my reticule which those men stole, without it. She couldn't finish the thought. This business partner, Caleb said slowly. He wouldn't happen to have any connection to those robbers, would he? Penelope's head snapped up, her eyes wide. The thought hadn't occurred to her, but now that he mentioned it. Vernon Walsh is a desperate man, she said, and not above using others to do his dirty work. Seems mighty convenient, Caleb observed. Bank gets robbed, and the only thing they take from you is the very document that stands between this Walsh fellow and your property. A cold certainty settled in Penelope's chest. You're right, it can't be coincidence. She pushed herself to her feet, sudden anger replacing her despair. He's behind this, I know he is. Caleb stood as well, his movements fluid despite his tall frame. What do you plan to do about it? The question stopped her short. What could she do? She was a woman alone, with no family left and few friends in town. The sheriff was wounded, and even if he weren't, she had no proof of Walsh's involvement. I don't know, she admitted, deflating. I have no idea what to do. Caleb studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he adjusted his hat and said, I might have a suggestion if you're willing to hear it. Why would you help me? Penelope asked, suddenly suspicious. You don't know me, no, he agreed, but I know men like Walsh, men who think they can take what isn't theirs simply because they want it. Something hardened in his eyes. I don't much care for that type. Penelope hesitated, weighing her options. She had little reason to trust this stranger, but she had even less reason to trust anyone else in Hillsborough right now. And there was something about Caleb Everett, a steadiness, a quiet strength that made her want to believe in him. What's your suggestion? She finally asked. First, he said, we get you somewhere safe. Then we find out where those robbers went with your reticule. And then, he added, a determined look crossing his face, we get your deed back. We, Penelope repeated, hope and doubt warring within her. Caleb nodded once. If you'll have my help. In that moment, standing in the dim light of the stable with straw at her feet and the scent of horses in the air, Penelope made a decision that would change the course of her life. I'll have your help, Mr. Everett, she said, extending her hand to him, and I'm grateful for it. His large hand engulfed her smaller one, warm and calloused from years of ranch work. Call me Caleb, he said, and you are Penelope Turner, she replied. My friends call me Penny. Well, Miss Turner, he said, releasing her hand, we'd best get started. Those men have a head start, and I reckon your business partner won't waste any time trying to claim what's yours. As they left the stable together, Penelope couldn't have known that the cowboy who had sat beside her in silence during her darkest moment would soon become the most important person in her world. Caleb led her to a modest boarding house on the outskirts of town, run by a widow named Mrs. Holcomb, who gave Penelope a sympathetic look but asked no questions when Caleb explained she needed a safe place to stay. He paid for a week in advance, ignoring Penelope's protests. You can pay me back once we've settled your troubles, he told her as Mrs. Holcomb showed her to a small but clean room. How do you plan to find the robbers? Penelope asked after the widow had left them alone in the parlor. They could be miles away by now. Caleb's mouth quirked in a slight smile. I've got a knack for tracking, he said. And men who rob banks tend to leave signs for those who know how to read them. There was something in his tone that made Penelope wonder if there was more to Caleb Everett than he was letting on, but she decided not to press the issue. He was helping her, and that was what mattered. Get some rest, he told her. I'll meet you here at dawn, we've got a long day ahead. Where are you going? She asked, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. To ask some questions, he said, settling his hat on his head. Town like this, somebody always sees something they shouldn't. After Caleb left, Penelope sat alone in the parlor, trying to make sense of the day's events. Just that morning, she had been preparing to confront Vernon Walsh with the deed, to put an end to his harassment once and for all. Now she was hiding in a boarding house, her future dependent on a cowboy she'd met only hours ago. Mrs. Holcomb brought her a simple supper on a tray and chatted amiably about town gossip, providing a welcome distraction from Penelope's worries. The older woman clearly wanted to know more about Penelope's situation, but was too polite to ask directly. "That Mr. Everett seems a decent sort," she commented as she collected Penelope's empty plate. "Known him long, have you?" "Not long at all," Penelope admitted. "But he's been very kind to me," Mrs. Holcomb nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen enough men come through this town to judge their character pretty quick. He's got honest eyes, that one." She patted Penelope's hand. "You sleep well now, dear. Whatever trouble you're in, it'll look better in the morning light." But Penelope found sleep elusive that night. Her mind kept returning to the robbery, to Walsh's smug face the last time she'd seen him, to the way Caleb had sat beside her in the stable, offering silent comfort when she needed it most. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were a confused jumble of gunshots and deeds and blue eyes watching her from beneath a cowboy hat. True to his word, Caleb returned at dawn. Penelope was already waiting for him in the parlor, dressed in her simplest day dress, her hair neatly braided and pinned up. She had borrowed a shawl from Mrs. Holcomb, as the morning air held a chill despite the promise of a warm day ahead. "You look rested," Caleb observed, though the shadows under her eyes suggested otherwise. "I'm ready to get my deed back," she said, squaring her shoulders. He nodded, seemingly approving of her determination. "I've got news," he said, keeping his voice low though they were alone in the room. "Those robbers weren't just passing through. They work for a man named Silas Garrett who owns the Diamond G Ranch about 20 miles north of here." "How did you find that out?" Penelope asked, impressed despite herself. "Barkeep at the saloon recognized one of them," Caleb explained. "Said he's been in before, flashing money around, bragging about working for Garrett." He paused. "Your Walsh and Garrett are business associates, apparently. They've been seen together in town several times over the past month." Penelope's heart sank. "So I was right. Vernon arranged the robbery to get the deed." "Seems that way," Caleb agreed. "The question is, where's the deed now, with Garrett or with Walsh?" "Walsh would want it as soon as possible," Penelope reasoned. "He's been trying to force me off the land for weeks." "Then we need to pay him a visit," Caleb said. "But not directly. If he sees you coming, he'll hide the evidence." "What do you suggest?" "We watch him," Caleb said. "See where he goes, who he meets. Sooner or later, he'll lead us to the deed." "And then what?" Penelope asked. Caleb's expression grew serious. "Then we take it back, one way or another." The plan was simple enough in theory. They would follow Walsh, observe his movements, and look for an opportunity to recover the deed. In practice, it meant long hours of waiting and watching, starting with Walsh's office in town. Caleb borrowed a wagon from an acquaintance, explaining to Penelope that it would attract less attention than two people on horseback. They positioned themselves across the street from Walsh's office, Penelope wearing a borrowed bonnet pulled low to hide her face. "Won't he recognize the wagon?" she asked as they settled in to wait. "Not likely," Caleb said. "It belongs to a farmer who comes to town every few days. Nothing unusual about it being here." They didn't have to wait long. Around mid-morning, Walsh emerged from his office, locked the door behind him, and headed toward the livery stable. He was a portly man in his 50s, with thinning hair and an air of self-importance that was visible in the way he carried himself. "He's getting his horse," Caleb observed. "Looks like he's leaving town." "Should we follow him?" Penelope asked, anxiety and anticipation mingling in her voice. "That's the plan," Caleb confirmed, taking up the reins. "But not too closely. We don't want him to spot us." They followed Walsh at a discreet distance as he rode north out of town. The road was dusty but well-traveled, winding through rolling hills dotted with mesquite and oak trees. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Penelope was grateful for the bonnet that shielded her face from its harsh rays. After about an hour's journey, Walsh turned off the main road onto a smaller track that led toward a ranch in the distance. From their vantage point on a small rise, Penelope and Caleb could see a substantial house, a large barn, and several outbuildings. "The Diamond G," Caleb murmured. "Garrett's place." "So he is going to meet Garrett," Penelope said. "What now?" Caleb considered for a moment. "We need to get closer, hear what they're saying if possible." He studied the landscape. "There's a stand of trees near the house. If we circle around and approach from the west, we might be able to get within earshot without being seen." They left the wagon hidden behind a cluster of rocks and proceeded on foot, moving carefully through the brush. Penelope's heart pounded with each step, fear and determination pushing her forward. They reached the trees without incident and crept closer to the house. Walsh had tied his horse at a hitching post and was now standing on the porch with another man, presumably Silas Garrett. He was tall and lean, with a shock of silver hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. The two men were engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. "I told you to be discreet," Walsh was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Robbing the bank in broad daylight was not what we agreed on." "My boys got the job done, didn't they?" Garrett replied, unperturbed by Walsh's anger. "You got your deed, that's what matters." "And 3 men dead, including the bank teller," Walsh hissed. "The sheriff's already asking questions." Garrett waved a dismissive hand. "Sheriff's got a bullet in his shoulder, he won't be asking much of anything for a while." "I want the deed," Walsh demanded. "Now." "I need to file it with the county clerk before that Turner woman realizes what's happened," Garrett chuckled. "You're in an awful hurry to claim that land." "We had a deal," Walsh reminded him. "The deed for 1/3 of the profits once I sell the timber rights." "About that," Garrett said, his tone changing subtly. "I've been thinking it over, and 1/3 seems a bit low, considering the risk my men took." Beside her, Penelope felt Caleb tense. She glanced at him and saw his jaw tighten as he listened to the men's conversation. "We agreed on 1/3, Walsh spluttered. "You can't change the terms now." "I believe I just did," Garrett said coolly. "Half the profits or you don't get the deed at all." Walsh's face reddened with anger. "You double-crossing, careful now," Garrett interrupted. "Remember who you're talking to." His hand moved to rest on the gun at his hip, a subtle but unmistakable threat. Walsh swallowed visibly, his anger giving way to fear. "Fine," he said after a moment. "Half, now give me the deed." Garrett smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "That's better. Come inside, I've got it in my safe." The two men disappeared into the house, leaving Penelope and Caleb alone with what they had learned. "They admitted to arranging the robbery," Penelope whispered, "and the deed is in Garrett's safe." "This changes things," Caleb said, his expression grim. "Breaking into a safe is a lot more complicated than snatching a document from Walsh's office." "What do we do?" Penelope asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We wait," he finally said. "Walsh will leave with the deed. We follow him back to town, then figure out how to get it from him before he can file it." They retreated to their hiding place and settled in to wait. The minutes stretched into an hour before Walsh finally emerged from the house, a satisfied look on his face. He mounted his horse and rode away, heading back toward Hillsborough. "Let's go," Caleb said, helping Penelope to her feet. "We need to get back to the wagon and follow him." They made their way back as quickly as they could, but by the time they reached the wagon and started after Walsh, he had a considerable lead. Caleb urged the horses to a faster pace, mindful of the rough road. "What if we're too late?" Penelope asked, clutching the seat as the wagon bounced over a rut. "What if he files the deed before we can stop him?" "The county clerk's office will be closed by the time he gets back to town," Caleb reassured her. "He'll have to wait until morning. That gives us tonight to come up with a plan." They followed Walsh back to Hillsborough, watching from a distance as he rode directly to his house on the edge of town. It was a substantial 2-story building with a wraparound porch, reflecting his status as a successful businessman. "Now we know where the deed is," Caleb said as they watched Walsh disappear inside. "At least for tonight." "Are you suggesting we break into his house?" Penelope asked, eyes wide. I'm suggesting we consider all our options, Caleb replied carefully. Breaking into his house is one of them. But it's risky, he thought for a moment. There might be another way, let me think on it. They returned the wagon to Caleb's acquaintance and walked back to the boarding house, discussing possibilities in low voices. By the time they reached Mrs. Holcomb's, Caleb had the outline of a plan. Walsh doesn't know I'm working with you, he explained as they sat in the parlor, cups of tea cooling before them. As far as he knows, I'm just a cowboy passing through town. How does that help us? Penelope asked, confused. It means I can approach him directly, Caleb said. I can tell him I overheard something at the saloon about the robbery, something that might interest him, make him think I want money for the information. And then what? And then I get into his house, Caleb said. Once I'm inside, I can look for the deed, Penelope frowned. That's incredibly dangerous. What if he suspects you? What if he's armed? He will be armed, Caleb acknowledged. Most men are out here, but he won't suspect me if I play it right. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending an unexpected warmth through her. I've done riskier things, Penny, trust me. The use of her nickname, spoken in his deep voice, made her heart skip a beat. She found herself nodding despite her reservations. I do trust you, she said, but I don't want you getting hurt on my account. I'll be careful, he promised, squeezing her hand before releasing it. Now I should go prepare. I'll pay Walsh a visit first thing in the morning before he can get to the clerk's office. What should I do? Penelope asked, not wanting to be left behind. Wait here, Caleb said. If all goes well, I'll be back with your deed before noon. She wanted to protest, to insist on coming with him, but she knew her presence would only complicate matters. Walsh knew her, would be instantly suspicious if he saw her. Reluctantly, she agreed to stay at the boarding house. After Caleb left, Penelope found herself unable to sit still. She paced the small parlor, replaying the day's events in her mind, worrying about what might happen when Caleb confronted Walsh. Mrs. Holcomb tried to engage her in conversation, but Penelope could barely focus on the older woman's words. You're sweet on him, aren't you? Mrs. Holcomb finally asked, interrupting Penelope's thoughts. What? No, Penelope began, then stopped herself. Was she developing feelings for Caleb? They'd known each other for barely a day, yet there was an undeniable connection between them. It's not like that, she said instead. He's helping me with a difficult situation, that's all, Mrs. Holcomb smiled knowingly. If you say so, dear. But I've been around long enough to recognize that look in a young woman's eyes. Penelope changed the subject, asking about Mrs. Holcomb's late husband and the boarding house, allowing the widow's reminiscences to distract her from her worries about Caleb. But as night fell and she retired to her room, those worries returned full force. Sleep was even more elusive than the previous night. Penelope tossed and turned, her mind filled with images of Caleb confronting Walsh, of gunfire and blood. When she did drift off, her dreams were vivid and disturbing. Caleb lying dead on Walsh's floor, the deed burning in a fireplace, her father's ranch being torn down to make way for timber harvesting. She woke before dawn, exhausted but unable to return to sleep. She dressed and went downstairs to find Mrs. Holcomb already up, preparing breakfast in the kitchen. You're up early, the widow observed. Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind, Penelope admitted, accepting a cup of coffee gratefully. Your cowboy will be fine, Mrs. Holcomb said, her intuition uncanny. He strikes me as a man who can handle himself. Penelope didn't correct the your cowboy assumption. Too preoccupied with thoughts of what Caleb might be doing at that very moment. Was he already on his way to Walsh's house? What would he say to gain entry? And what would he do if Walsh refused to let him in? The morning dragged by with agonizing slowness. Penelope tried to help Mrs. Holcomb with chores around the boarding house, but her mind wasn't on her work. She kept glancing at the clock, watching the hands move closer to noon, the time Caleb had said he'd return if all went well. When a knock came at the door just after 11, Penelope's heart leaped. She hurried to answer it, expecting to see Caleb's tall figure on the porch. Instead, she found the town's deputy, a young man named Frank Miller, standing there with his hat in his hands. "Miss Turner?" he asked, though he clearly recognized her. "Yes," she replied, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. "What is it, deputy?" "There's been an incident at Vernon Walsh's house," Deputy Miller said, his expression grave. "A man was shot. Mr. Walsh claims he was a thief, but—" He hesitated. "The man's been asking for you, says his name is Caleb Everett." Penelope's world tilted sideways. "Is he—" She couldn't finish the question. "He's alive," the deputy assured her quickly. "Doc Simmons is with him now, but he's in a bad way, madam. I thought you should know." "Where is he?" Penelope asked, already reaching for her shawl. "They took him to the doctor's office," Deputy Miller said. "I can escort you there if you'd like." "Please," Penelope said, her voice barely above a whisper. The walk to the doctor's office was the longest of Penelope's life, though it was only a few blocks. Deputy Miller tried to explain what had happened, something about Walsh claiming Caleb had broken in, a confrontation, a gunshot, but Penelope barely heard him. All she could think about was Caleb, wounded because of her, because he had tried to help her, doctor. Simmons met them at the door of his office, his shirt sleeves rolled up, blood staining his hands. "He's stable," he told Penelope without preamble. "Bullet went through his shoulder, missed anything vital, but he's lost a good amount of blood." "Can I see him?" Penelope asked, her voice shaking. Dr. Simmons nodded. "Briefly, he needs rest, but he's been asking for you." He led her to a small room at the back of the office where Caleb lay on a narrow bed, his upper body bandaged, his face pale against the pillows. His eyes were closed, but they opened as she approached, focusing on her face with visible effort. "Penny," he murmured, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Sorry about this." She knelt beside the bed, taking his hand in hers, careful not to jostle him. "What happened? Walsh shot you." Caleb nodded weakly. "He wasn't buying my story, got suspicious when I mentioned the robbery." He took a shallow breath. "I managed to see the deed, though. It was on his desk. He was preparing to take it to the clerk." "Don't worry about that now," Penelope said, tears filling her eyes. "Just rest. Get better." "No time," Caleb insisted, tightening his grip on her hand. "He'll file it today once he does." He didn't need to finish the thought. Once Walsh filed the deed, Penelope would have no legal claim to her father's ranch. "What can I do?" she asked desperately. "There must be something." Caleb's eyes closed briefly as if gathering strength. "The sheriff," he said. "Tell him everything, about Walsh and Garrett, about the bank robbery. But will he believe me? I have no proof." "You have me," Caleb said. "I heard them talking at Garrett's ranch." "That's testimony." He grimaced in pain. "And there's something else, something I didn't tell you." Penelope leaned closer. "What is it?" "I know Garrett," Caleb admitted. "From before. Used to ride with his outfit years back before I went straight." He met her eyes, a hint of shame in his gaze. "I wasn't always on the right side of the law, Penny." The revelation surprised her, but it didn't change how she felt about him. If anything, it made his willingness to help her, to risk himself for her, even more meaningful. "That doesn't matter now," she assured him. "What matters is stopping Walsh." Dr. Simmons approached, indicating that her time was up. "He needs rest, Miss Turner." Penelope squeezed Caleb's hand one last time. "I'll go to the sheriff," she promised, "and I'll be back as soon as I can." "Be careful," Caleb warned. "Walsh is desperate now." "Dangerous?" She nodded, then impulsively leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Rest," she murmured. "I'll handle this." The sheriff's office was just down the street from the doctor's. Sheriff Tom Harker was at his desk, his arm in a sling from the wound he'd received during the bank robbery. He looked up as Penelope entered, recognition dawning on his weathered face. "Miss Turner," he said, rising to his feet. "I heard about what happened at Walsh's place." "You know the man who was shot?" "Yes," Penelope said, her resolve strengthening. "And I need to tell you what's really going on, Sheriff. It's about the bank robbery and Vernon Walsh and my father's ranch." Sheriff Harker gestured to a chair. "I'm listening." Penelope told him everything about her father's death, Walsh's claims on the ranch, the deed that had been in her reticule when the bank was robbed. what she and Caleb had overheard at Garrett's ranch. The sheriff listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly grim. "That's a serious accusation," he said when she had finished. "Claiming Walsh orchestrated the bank robbery to steal your deed." "It's the truth," Penelope insisted. "Caleb and I both heard Walsh and Garrett discussing it." "Everett," the sheriff mused. "The name's familiar." He studied her. "You trust him? A man you just met?" "With my life," Penelope said without hesitation. Sheriff Harker seemed to come to a decision. "I've had my suspicions about Walsh for a while," he admitted, "and Garrett's been rumored to be involved in various unsavory activities." He stood up. "I think it's time I paid Mr. Walsh a visit before he can file that deed." "I'm coming with you," Penelope said, rising as well. The sheriff looked like he wanted to object, but something in her expression must have changed his mind. "Stay behind me," he warned. "If Walsh is as desperate as you say, there's no telling what he might do." They walked to the county clerk's office together, the sheriff moving with determination despite his injured arm. Inside, they found Walsh at the counter, papers spread before him, the clerk examining what Penelope immediately recognized as her father's deed. "Hold on there, Henry," Sheriff Harker called to the clerk. "Don't file those papers just yet." Walsh whirled around, his face paling when he saw Penelope. "What is the meaning of this, Sheriff?" he demanded, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm conducting legitimate business." "Is that so?" the sheriff replied. "Miss Turner here has a different story. Says that deed rightfully belongs to her and that you arranged to have it stolen from her during the bank robbery." Walsh's eyes darted between them, panic beginning to show through his bluster. "That's absurd. The girl is delusional. Her father left the ranch to me." "Then you won't mind if I take a closer look at that deed," Sheriff Harker interrupted, moving toward the counter. Walsh's hand moved to his jacket, and Penelope saw with horror that he was reaching for a gun. "Sheriff," she cried out in warning. Sheriff Harker, despite his wounded arm, was faster. He drew his revolver and aimed it squarely at Walsh. "Don't do it, Vernon," he said coldly. "Not unless you want to join those bank robbers in the cemetery." Walsh froze, his hand still inside his jacket. For a tense moment, Penelope thought he might try to draw anyway, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He slowly removed his empty hand from his jacket. "Henry," the sheriff said to the clerk, who was watching the scene with wide eyes, "I'll take that deed now." The clerk handed the document to Sheriff Harker, who examined it briefly before passing it to Penelope. "This look like your father's deed?" he asked. Penelope's hands trembled as she took the familiar paper, the one she had kept so carefully until it was stolen from her. "Yes," she said, relief washing over her. "This is it." "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Walsh said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "You have no proof of these wild accusations." "I've got enough to hold you for questioning," Sheriff Harker replied. "And once I talk to your friend Garrett and that cowboy who was at your house this morning, I expect I'll have plenty more." He gestured to Walsh's jacket. "Now, slowly remove that gun and place it on the counter." Walsh complied, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. As the sheriff took him into custody, Penelope clutched the deed to her chest, hardly able to believe that she had recovered it, that her father's legacy was secure once more. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said as Harker led Walsh toward the door. "Don't thank me yet," he cautioned. "We've still got to sort this all out. But for now, that deed stays with you where it belongs." Penelope nodded, understanding that there would be legal proceedings ahead, testimony to give, questions to answer. But the immediate danger had passed. She had her deed back and Walsh was in custody. Her thoughts turned immediately to Caleb. She needed to tell him what had happened, to thank him for his help, to be with him as he recovered from his wound. With a brief farewell to the sheriff and the bewildered clerk, she hurried back to Dr. Simmons's office. Caleb was asleep when she arrived, his breathing steady but shallow. Dr. Simmons assured her that he was doing as well as could be expected. "He'll need time to heal," the doctor told her. "That shoulder will take weeks to mend properly." "Can he be moved?" Penelope asked, an idea forming in her mind. Dr. Simmons considered the question. Not today and not far, but in a day or two, if he's stable, a short journey by wagon might be possible. Why do you ask? I want to take him to my ranch, Penelope explained. It's peaceful there, good for recovery. And I owe him so much, it's the least I can do. The doctor nodded thoughtfully. We'll see how he does. If he continues to improve, perhaps in a couple of days. Penelope settled into a chair beside Caleb's bed, prepared to wait as long as necessary for him to wake. As she watched his chest rise and fall with each breath, she reflected on the extraordinary events of the past 2 days. She had gone from despair in a stable corner to hope restored, all because this man had sat beside her in silence when she needed it most. Caleb stirred, his eyes opening slowly to find her watching him. A smile touched his lips. You're back, he murmured. I am, she confirmed, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. And I have news. The sheriff arrested Walsh. I have my deed back. Relief washed over Caleb's features. Good, he said. That's good. It's all thanks to you, Penelope said softly. You risked everything to help me, a stranger. Not a stranger anymore, Caleb replied, his eyes holding hers. Not for a while now. The intensity of his gaze made her heart flutter. No, she agreed. Not strangers at all. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. Finally, Penelope said, I want you to come to my ranch when you're well enough to travel, to recover there. Caleb looked surprised. You don't have to do that. I want to, she insisted. Please, Caleb, let me help you now as you helped me. He studied her face, seeming to search for something in her expression. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. All right, he said, when the doc says I can travel. 3 days later, Dr. Simmons declared Caleb fit enough for the journey to the Turner Ranch. Sheriff Harker had been busy in the meantime, gathering evidence against Walsh and sending deputies to Garrett's ranch to bring him in for questioning. The bank robbers who had survived the initial shootout had been captured trying to flee to Mexico and had implicated both Walsh and Garrett in exchange for leniency. The wagon ride to the ranch was slow and careful, with Penelope driving and Caleb resting on a makeshift bed of blankets in the back. The Turner Ranch was about 10 miles outside of Hillsborough, a modest spread with good grazing land, a sturdy house and outbuildings that showed signs of recent repair. It's not much, Penelope said as they approached the main house, but it's home. It's beautiful, Caleb said, taking in the rolling pastures and the distant line of trees that marked the property's boundary. Your father built all this, started with almost nothing, Penelope confirmed proudly. Built it up over 20 years. It was his dream to pass it on to me, to see it continue to grow. She helped Caleb down from the wagon, supporting him as they walked to the house. I couldn't bear the thought of losing it. The house was simple but comfortable, with a large kitchen, a parlor, and 3 bedrooms. Penelope had prepared the largest bedroom for Caleb, making sure it was clean and welcoming. An older Mexican woman named Alina, who had worked for the Turners for years as a housekeeper and cook, greeted them warmly and immediately set about fussing over Caleb's injury. Alina practically raised me after my mother died, Penelope explained as the older woman insisted on checking Caleb's bandages. She's a better nurse than most doctors. The next few weeks established a routine. Caleb rested and gradually regained his strength, moving from the bedroom to the porch as he improved, sitting in the sunshine and watching the daily operations of the ranch. Penelope divided her time between caring for him, managing the ranch and occasional trips into town to meet with the sheriff or her father's lawyer. They talked for hours each day about their pasts, their dreams, their views on life. Penelope learned that Caleb had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, had lost his parents young, and had drifted west in search of opportunity. He had fallen in with Garrett's gang for a time, drawn by the promise of easy money, but had left that life behind after a robbery went wrong and an innocent man was killed. I've been trying to make up for it ever since, he told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vivid oranges and pinks. "Working honest jobs, helping people when I can." "Is that why you helped me?" Penelope asked. "To atone for your past." Caleb considered the question. "Maybe at first," he admitted, "but not for long." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "There was something about you, Penny. Something that made me want to help, not because I should, but because I couldn't bear to see you hurt." The confession made her breath catch. They had been circling around their feelings for weeks, growing closer with each passing day, but neither had put those feelings into words until now. "I've never met anyone like you," Penelope said softly. "When you sat beside me in that stable, not saying a word, just being there. No one had ever done that for me before. Just let me feel what I needed to feel without trying to fix it or rush me through it." Caleb's hand found hers on the porch railing, his fingers warm against hers. "Sometimes silence says more than words ever could." They sat that way until the last light faded from the sky, holding hands and watching the stars emerge, a comfortable silence between them that held all the words they weren't yet ready to speak. As spring gave way to summer, Caleb's wound healed completely, though he still carried a scar that would remain for life. He began to help around the ranch, first with small tasks and then with more substantial work. He had a way with the horses and a knack for spotting potential problems before they became serious. One evening in late June, as they walked back from checking on a new foal in the barn, Caleb stopped suddenly in the middle of the yard. "I should be moving on," he said, though his tone suggested it was the last thing he wanted to do. Penelope's heart contracted painfully at the thought. "Why?" she asked. "You're welcome here as long as you want to stay." "That's just it," Caleb said, turning to face her. "I don't want to take advantage of your hospitality. You've done so much for me already." "Is that what you think you're doing?" Penelope asked, hurt creeping into her voice. Taking advantage, Caleb ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "No, that's not. I'm not saying this right." He took a deep breath. "Penny, I care for you, more than I've ever cared for anyone, but I'm just a cowboy with a past that would make most decent folk turn away. You deserve better." "Don't tell me what I deserve," Penelope said, stepping closer to him. "I know my own mind, Caleb Everett, and my own heart." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you. I think I've loved you since that day in the stable when you sat beside me and didn't say a word." Caleb's eyes widened, hope and disbelief warring in their blue depths. "Penny," he breathed, his hand covering hers where it rested against his cheek. "Are you sure? I don't have much to offer a woman like you." "You have everything to offer," she insisted. "Courage, kindness, strength. That's worth more than money or status or a spotless past." She smiled up at him. "Besides, this ranch needs a good manager, someone who knows horses and cattle who can help me build on what my father started." "Are you offering me a job, Miss Turner?" Caleb asked, a smile beginning to tug at his lips. "I'm offering you a partnership," Penelope replied, "in every sense of the word." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Penny Turner," he said, his voice filled with wonder, "are you proposing to me?" "I believe I am," she confirmed, her heart racing. "Though it's terribly improper of me," Caleb laughed, a rich, warm sound that Penelope had come to treasure. "Propriety be damned," he said, and then he was kissing her, his arms encircling her waist, drawing her close against him. Penelope had been kissed before, awkward, hesitant kisses from boys in town who had courted her briefly. But this was different. This was a man who knew his mind and his heart, who poured everything he felt for her into the press of his lips against hers. She responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck, her body molding to his as if they had been made to fit together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "In case it wasn't clear," he murmured, "that was a yes." They were married a month later in the small church in Hillsborough, with Alina, Mrs. Holcomb, and Sheriff Harker among the guests who witnessed their vows. Penelope wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Alina's skilled hands, and carried wildflowers gathered from the pastures of her ranch, their ranch now. As summer turned to fall, they settled into life together, working side by side to improve the ranch to make it prosper. Caleb proved to have a good head for business as well as ranching, suggesting new breeding stock that improved their herd and finding better markets for their cattle. News came that Vernon Walsh had been convicted for his role in the bank robbery and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Silas Garrett had managed to escape before he could be arrested, reportedly fleeing to Mexico, but his gang had been broken up, its members either dead, imprisoned, or scattered. "You think he'll come back?" Penelope asked Caleb one evening as they sat by the fire in their parlor, discussing the news. "Garrett, I mean," Caleb considered the question seriously. "He might," he acknowledged. "He's not the type to forgive a slight, and he'll blame us for what happened to his operation." He reached over to take her hand. "But we'll be ready if he does. I won't let anything happen to you or to our home." The protective fierceness in his voice warmed her heart. "Our home," she repeated, loving the sound of those words on her lips. "It still feels like a dream sometimes that you're here with me." "If it's a dream," Caleb said, drawing her into his arms, "then I never want to wake up." Winter came, bringing cold winds and occasional snow that blanketed the ranch in white. They spent the long evenings planning for spring, for the improvements they would make when the weather turned, for the future they would build together. In January, Penelope discovered she was expecting their first child. Caleb's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "A baby," he said, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Caleb assured her, kissing her softly. "You've given me more than I dared to dream of, Penny: a home, a purpose, your love, and now a child." His voice broke slightly on the last word. As her pregnancy progressed, Penelope often thought back to that day in the stable, to the despair she had felt, and the unexpected comfort of a stranger sitting beside her in silence. How could she have known then that that simple act of kindness would lead to this: a life filled with love and purpose, a future bright with promise? Their son was born in late August, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair. They named him James Thomas Everett, after Penelope's father and Sheriff Harker, who had helped bring Walsh to justice. Caleb proved to be a natural father, as gentle and patient with his son as he was capable and strong in his work on the ranch. Watching him rock the baby to sleep, his large hands cradling their child with infinite care, Penelope felt her heart might burst with love for both of them. The years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising. The ranch prospered under their joint management, expanding to include neighboring land when it became available. James was joined by a sister, Eleanor, 2 years later, and then by another brother, William, the following year. Silas Garrett never returned to Texas, news eventually reaching them that he had been killed in a dispute over a card game in a border town. Vernon Walsh served his sentence and then disappeared, rumored to have gone east to start a new life far from the scenes of his crimes. Mrs. Holcomb passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving her boarding house to a niece who continued to welcome travelers to Hillsborough. Eleanor remained with the Everetts, becoming a beloved grandmother figure to the children, teaching them Spanish and how to make her famous tortillas. Sheriff Harker retired and was succeeded by Frank Miller, who proved to be a fair and capable lawman. Hillsborough grew slowly but steadily, the railroad eventually reaching it and bringing new opportunities for commerce. Through it all, Caleb and Penelope's bond remained strong, deepening with each passing year. Each shared joy and sorrow. They worked together, raised their children together, built a life that exceeded anything either of them had imagined possible. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they rode out together to a hilltop overlooking the ranch, watching the sunset as they had so many times before. Their land spread out below them, green and thriving, cattle grazing peacefully in the pastures, the house and barns solid and well-maintained. "Did you ever think, that day in the stable, that we'd end up here?" Penelope asked, leaning against Caleb's shoulder as they sat side by side on a blanket. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I just saw a woman in pain and wanted to help somehow." He turned to look at her, the setting sun highlighting the silver that had begun to appear at his temples. "I certainly never imagined I'd fall in love with her." "When did you know?" Penelope asked curiously. "That you loved me," Caleb smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I think it started that very first day, when you pulled yourself together and were ready to fight for what was yours, despite everything. But I knew for certain when I was lying in that doctor's office with a bullet hole in my shoulder, and all I could think about was whether you were safe." Penelope reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar lines that the years had etched there. "I'm so glad you sat down beside me that day," she said softly. "So glad you didn't walk away." "Best decision I ever made," Caleb agreed, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Except for saying yes when you proposed to me," Penelope laughed, the sound floating out across the land they had nurtured together. "I was scandalously forward, wasn't I?" "You were perfect," Caleb corrected her, drawing her into his arms. "You are perfect." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, they held each other close, secure in a love that had begun in silence and grief, but had blossomed into something strong enough to weather any storm, deep enough to sustain them through whatever the future might bring. Back at the house, their children waited, along with the life they had built together, a life that had started with a simple act of compassion in a stable corner, when a cowboy had sat beside a crying woman in silence, offering the one thing she needed most in that moment, the quiet assurance that she was not alone. And in the years that followed, through all the joys and sorrows that life brought their way, they never were alone again.